Hey, Alex from GMAT Ninja here. Welcome to the second video in our Reading Comp series. This one's going to tackle points of view, keeping track of who exactly is speaking as you go through a passage. Now, one common pitfall that students run into all the time is no matter who is speaking as they're going through a passage, they always assume, okay, I'm getting the author's point of view. This is what the author thinks. Now, sometimes that'll actually be the case, but a large percentage of the time, the author is going to be presenting someone else's point of view. Maybe a scholar, maybe a historical figure, and then maybe those scholars and historical figures will disagree, and then the author will come in and present their own point of view, or maybe the author will stand back and just prevent other people's points of view. But whatever it is, you always want to ask yourself, who exactly is speaking? Is it the author? Is it someone else? Now, this is a pitfall, as I said, lots of students run into this. One person in particular comes to mind, a really strong reader named RJ. Now, we encountered this mystery, which was, okay, half the time he would get totally annihilated on the passages he was doing. And we couldn't figure out, if you're such a strong reader, you're doing great half the time. Well, when we had this discussion, it turned out he was conflating whatever was being said with the author's own point of view. So to deal with that, we said, okay, well, here's what you want to do. Ask yourself, not just what am I reading, but who is speaking? And once you're aware of that, you want to ask yourself, okay, why is this being mentioned by the author? How does it contribute to the author's overall purpose? So once RJ was able to ask himself these questions, he became a lot more consistent. So this is something we're going to practice today. You want to do this on every passage, no question. But I picked two that I think are going to present some special challenges. We're going to go from medium to hard in terms of the passages. So if the first one feels like a breeze to you, feel free to skip ahead to the second one. Now, as you're reading these, the most important thing is pause after each paragraph and ask yourself, what was the author's purpose in writing this? And then come up with a quick summary for that. Now, as an exercise, I also want you to ask yourself as you're going, at every point, who is it that's speaking? Whose point of view am I getting? The author, someone else? And then on top of that, why is this being mentioned? How is it contributing to that overall purpose? All right, so let's take a look at this first passage. Okay, first paragraph. So what's going on here? Okay, well, I notice we have this idea of Republican motherhood being presented, the idea that you need to raise politically virtuous sons, and then those sons are going to lead to a successful government. Is that the author's point of view? Well, notice if we look at the second paragraph, the second sentence, Kerber maintained that the leaders of the new nation wanted women to be educated. Okay, so that's the leaders of the new nation. That's their point of view. Why is this idea of Republican motherhood being mentioned? Well, Linda Kerber thinks that this ideology of Republican motherhood resulted in a surge of educational opportunities for women in the United States. Okay, so Linda Kerber is presenting Republican motherhood to back up her thesis here. Where does the author come in to all this? Because after all, that's what we're looking for, is the author's purpose. Is the author trying to present this idea of Republican motherhood, this thesis? Well, I don't get the sense that the author takes a position on it one way or another. Looking it over, I think the author is just presenting Linda Kerber's ideas. So that's how I'm going to phrase the purpose of this first paragraph, right? Not to argue for Republican motherhood or to argue for some particular thesis, but in fact, to present Linda Kerber's thesis. Okay. And in a big picture way, I think that really captures the purpose of the first paragraph. But to give a little more detail, what is this thesis exactly? Well, the thesis is that an ideology of Republican motherhood led to a surge of educational opportunities for women. And when did this happen? Well, according to Kerber, this is after the American Revolution. Okay, so notice we have a bunch of different points of view here. You have the point of view of the nation's new leaders. They believe in Republican motherhood. You have the idea that Republican motherhood itself led to a surge of educational opportunities after the revolution. That's Linda Kerber's idea. And then you have the author not doing too much. The author's purpose, I'd say, just to present that thesis. Okay, let's take a look at the second paragraph. Okay, so what's going on in the second paragraph? Okay, well, we have this new scholar introduced, Thomas Woody. And what does Woody think? Well, Woody has an opinion about education for women. He thinks that it started increasing before the revolution. Okay, so is that the idea to argue that this was the case? Well, what is the author doing with this? Why is the author mentioning Thomas Woody? Well, notice as you come to the end of the paragraph, the author thinks, well, Thomas Woody's ideas are going to call Linda Kerber's thesis into question. You know, Linda Kerber said educational opportunities started after the American Revolution. That's when the opportunities for women started to increase. But Thomas Woody thinks, no, that wasn't the case. In fact, it started before. So if I'm thinking about, okay, what is this paragraph doing here? How does it relate to the previous one? What's the author really up to? I'd say the author primarily is presenting a challenge to Linda Kerber's thesis. Okay, and then again, is this the author going to present their own points of view? Did the author do their own research, that sort of thing? No, not at all. The author is citing Thomas Woody's ideas to challenge Linda Kerber's thesis. Okay, so to present a challenge to Linda Kerber's thesis by citing ideas of Thomas Woody. What were Woody's ideas? Well, actually, that educational opportunities for women started before the revolution. Started increasing before the revolution. Okay, so I have a bunch of different points of view. The nation's new leaders have ideas, Thomas Woody has ideas, Linda Kerber has ideas, and then the author has a feeling about how all these relate. Notice Thomas Woody's not stepping out there and challenging Linda Kerber. That's what the author is doing. The author is taking Woody's ideas and using them to challenge Linda Kerber's ideas. So that's overall what's going on in this passage. That's what the author's up to. Okay, so let's see if that helps with the questions. Let's take a look at the first question. Okay, question 1. According to the passage, within the field of educational history, Thomas Woody's 1929 work was. Okay, according to the passage. So just a small little part of the question, but really important. That's telling us I want the author's point of view, according to the author. So it's not just a true statement necessarily about Woody, but the author's specific point of view on Woody. Now it says Thomas's 1929 work was, okay, so that particular aspect of Woody's work. Now, just taking a step back, I already know why the author is talking about Woody. Woody thought educational opportunities for women started increasing before the American Revolution, and then that can be used to challenge Kerber's ideas. So that kind of positions me for this question. But let's take a look at the second paragraph. And let's just see, is there anything else notable going on there? Okay, well, Thomas Woody's 1929 work, boom, it's mentioned right in the first sentence. Prior to Kerber's work, educational historians barely mentioned women and girls. Thomas Woody's 1929 work is the notable exception. Okay, and then it goes on to talk about newspaper advertisements and other evidence that Woody found to support his ideas. Specifically, that educational opportunities started increasing for women and girls before the revolution. Okay, so that gives me some specific ideas about what did the author think about this 1929 work. It was a notable exception. Why was it an exception? Well, prior to Kerber's work, historians barely mentioned women and girls. Okay, so I guess Thomas Woody must have mentioned women and girls. That's why he was a notable exception. That's what the author thinks about this 1929 work. Okay, so let's take a look at the answer choices. According to the passage, within the field of educational history, Thomas Woody's 1929 work was A, innovative because it relied on newspaper advertisements as evidence. Okay, well, it does rely on newspaper advertisements as evidence, or at least Thomas Woody did at some point. But I don't think that's why this 1929 work was innovative. It was innovative because it was a notable exception in that it focused on women and girls. Okay. B, exceptional in that it concentrated on the period before the American Revolution. Well, Woody did focus on the period before the American Revolution, but is that why this 1929 work was exceptional, according to the author? No, that's not the reason. C, unusual in that it focused on educational attitudes rather than on educational practices. So this distinction between attitudes and practices, I don't remember that being brought up particularly. It's also not the reason that the 1929 work was notable or unusual, so C is no good. Controversial in its claims regarding educational opportunities for boys. Okay, well, a couple things catch my eye there. I don't remember it talking about a controversy, and also the focus was on education for girls. That's what made it exceptional and different. So D doesn't do a good job. E, atypical in that it examined the education of girls. Okay, so the author thought it was a notable exception. Sounds like atypical to me. Not the exact same words, but the same ideas. In that it examined the education of girls. Yes, that's the reason. Previous work did not focus on the education of girls. This one was a notable exception. Okay, so the answer is E to question number 1. Let's check out question number 2. Okay, question number 2. The passage suggests that with regard to the history of women's education in the United States, Kerber's work differs from Woody's, primarily concerning which of the following? Okay, so I'm glad that I have these nice, crisp statements of the author's purpose with all the points of view kept very distinct, because I know Kerber's work differs from Woody's primarily concerning which of the following. Okay, the author was really concerned about this difference. Woody thought that educational opportunities for women started increasing before the American Revolution, but Kerber's whole thesis is that well, it wasn't until the American Revolution that you have this ideology of Republican motherhood, and then women's educational opportunities start increasing. So they disagree about when that happened. Okay, so let's take a look at these answers. A, the extent to which women were interested in pursuing educational opportunities in the 18th century. Okay, well, let's think about that. Women interested in pursuing educational opportunities. Well, I know that the opportunities for women changed during the 18th century, but what was women themselves' point of view on that? Did they differ on that? Were some of them interested? Were some of them less interested? Did Woody and Kerber have different ideas? Well, notice that's one point of view we never get. We never actually hear what did the women think about the educational opportunities given to them. All we know is like the nation's new leaders and Kerber and Woody, the women themselves, we actually never hear their point of view. Okay, so for that reason, it just couldn't be A. How about B? The extent of the support for educational opportunities for girls prior to the American Revolution. Okay, so I know this was, according to the author, a point of tension between these two. Woody thought that, yes, these educational opportunities started increasing before the American Revolution. Kerber thought, no, you have this ideology of Republican motherhood, and then after the Revolution, the educational opportunities for women and girls start increasing. Okay, so does it make sense to say they disagreed about the extent of support for educational opportunities prior to the American Revolution? That sounds pretty good. Okay, how about C? The extent of public resistance to educational opportunities for women after the American Revolution. Okay, so two things there catch my ear. Do they disagree about what happened after the American Revolution? Well, notice the whole problem is that they're disagreeing about what happened before. So after, I don't think that we know how they feel about that. Do they agree, disagree? They both thought by that point educational opportunities had increased. Okay, but C actually isn't even talking about educational opportunities. It's public resistance to educational opportunities. Okay, now I could start to speculate about that. With Republican motherhood, was there less resistance to educational opportunities? But notice I'm starting to stray from what's said in the passage. That would be a pretty big leap. On top of which, it's not after the American Revolution that they're disagreeing about. So I don't like C. Okay, D, whether attitudes towards women's educational opportunities changed during the 18th century. Okay, well, I know for sure they both thought that attitudes towards women's educational opportunities changed. So that's not something that they differ about. Sure, they differ about when it happened, but they were both thought it happened sometime, 1750s, 1770s, looking at those dates, that's all the 18th century. So, okay, it's not D. E, whether women needed to be educated in order to contribute to the success of a Republican form of government. Okay, so remember, this idea that women need to be educated, that's Republican motherhood. Whose idea is that? Is that Kerber and Woody? Well, remember, we were really careful about points of view, and we were like, no, that's the nation's new leaders. They're the ones who think women need to be educated. That's not Kerber and Woody. This isn't something that they're disagreeing about at all. Okay, so we're left with B. B does a good job. Okay, so there's the right answer. Let's take a look at the next question. Okay, question 3. The passage suggests that Woody would have agreed with which of the following claims regarding an essay on woman? Okay, so we want Woody's point of view on an essay on woman. Which of these is a claim that he probably would have agreed with? Okay, well, we already know Thomas Woody's basic idea is that educational opportunities for women start increasing before the revolution. So presumably that's going to be relevant here. But let's take a closer look at the second paragraph, see if there's anything else we should be aware of. Okay, I'm scanning it. I see an essay on woman. That's the bolded sentence. Let's start with the previous sentence just to make sure we have the context. Okay, examining newspaper advertisements for academies, Woody found that educational opportunities increased for both girls and boys around 1750. Okay, pointing to an essay on woman as reflecting a shift in view, Woody also claimed that practical education for females had many advocates before the revolution. Okay, so Woody is pointing to this essay because it reflects a shift in view, and it shows how there were practical educational opportunities for females before the revolution. There were, in fact, many advocates for that. This article is supporting that idea. Okay, so big picture, this essay is being cited by Woody to support his points of view. So let's see. Let's go through the answers. A, it expressed attitudes concerning women's education that were reflected in new educational opportunities for women after 1750. Okay, so Woody thinks that before the American Revolution, and if we look back at those dates, he mentions the 1750s, you have new educational opportunities for women and girls, and he points to this essay in order to support that. So A kind of makes sense. It expresses attitudes concerning women's education reflected in new educational opportunities after 750. Okay, so that all lines up. Let's hold on to that. B, it persuaded educators to offer greater educational opportunities to women in the 1750s. Okay, well, I know it reflects the view that women's educational opportunities were increasing in the 1750s, but did it persuade educators? Okay, I could speculate, well, how would educators have responded to this? Maybe they would have agreed or disagreed. But again, notice I'm straying from the passage there. I don't really get any specifics on how educators felt about this. Were any of them persuaded? I have no idea. Okay, C. It articulated ideas about women's education that would not be realized until after the American Revolution. Okay, so keep in mind, Woody thinks educational opportunities for women started increasing before the revolution. This says, well, not until after the revolution. That gets it wrong. Okay, D. It offered one of the most original arguments in favor of women's education in the United States in the 18th century. Okay, so does Woody ever say that this was a very original argument, or in fact, one of the most original arguments in favor of women's education? That, again, would be a big leap. You know, it's reflecting the idea that women should have educational opportunities in the 1750s, but that would be a big leap to say that it's one of the most original arguments. Okay, so D is out. E, it presented views about women's education that were still controversial in Woody's own time. Okay, interesting. So Woody's own time, well, Woody was 1929. So what were the thoughts about women's education then? Well, notice the passage doesn't even get into that. Uh, Woody's own time, views on women's education then, just outside the scope of the passage. Okay, so we're left with A. Okay, so that's our first passage. We're going to do another one, which is going to require a similar style of focus on points of view. So again, let's go through this, do the same thing as before. For each paragraph, ask yourself, what's the author's purpose? And once you've articulated that, be thinking, okay, whose points of view was I getting, and how do those all contribute to that overall purpose? Okay, let's look at the next passage. Okay, so what's going on in this paragraph? Well, we have a whole bunch of different points of view being presented. So let's try to keep them distinct and separate, and then think about how are they all being combined together to somehow contribute to the author's purpose. Okay, well, we start with Jacob Burckhardt's view. What does Burckhardt think? That Renaissance women had perfect equality with Renaissance men. Okay, but why is Burckhardt mentioned? Well, feminist scholars refer to him in order to disagree with him and to say that, in fact, the Renaissance was a terrible time for women and it was worse than the medieval times, and essentially rejecting Burckhardt's view. Okay, and then if we read further, we get yet different feminist scholars. And what's their point of view? Well, they disagree with both Burckhardt and Kelly. Okay, so and then where does the author come into all this? Is the author weighing in, picking sides, accepting or rejecting any of these ideas? Not really, right? The author, it looks like, is pretty much just presenting them and bringing up Burckhardt and Kelly in order to introduce yet another group of feminist scholars who reject both of them. So when I articulate to myself what's the author's purpose, it's not going to be any of these ideas in particular. It's rather just to be presenting arguments. More specifically, present the ideas of feminist scholars. And again, I could sort of stop there. That's kind of overall what the author's doing, but that doesn't give me enough detail, really. So I want to say, okay, to present the ideas of feminist scholars, and what's their point of view? Well, they reject both Burckhardt's rosy view. Burckhardt thought that there was perfect equality for Renaissance women, and Kelly's dark view. Okay, so again, does the author tell us what he or she thinks of these scholars? Not really. We just know, okay, here's some feminist scholars that reject both the rosy and the dark views of previous scholars. Okay, let's take a look at the second paragraph. Okay, so what's going on in this second paragraph? Well, it's pretty dense. So let's ask ourselves, okay, big picture, what's going on here? You know, if we have to summarize, give a brief summary the way we did for the first paragraph. Okay, well, notice as we're starting off, we read, the trend is also evident. Okay, so previously we read this trend of scholars who are rejecting both Burckhardt and Kelly. They reject the rosy view and the dark view. So now I'm getting the idea, okay, we're going to push ahead with that trend. We're going to hear more about it. Okay, so I keep reading a little bit more about this trend, and then this character is introduced, Tina Contiris, and we're told, okay, so this trend is continuing, and then, for example, we have Tina Contiris. Okay, so that's signaling to me, all right, we're continuing to talk about the idea of feminist scholars who reject both Burckhardt and Kelly, and then as an example, we're given Tina Contiris. Okay, and then what did Contiris think? So I read a little farther down. Well, Contiris was cautiously optimistic about Renaissance women's achievements, but also stressed social obstacles. So to me, that sounds like, yeah, that's pretty much an example of these feminist scholars. They're not super positive, they're not super dark, they're cautiously optimistic, but also recognize that there are social obstacles. Okay, so sure, there's a whole lot of details I could dive into, but really overall, what's the author's purpose here? Well, it's to present an example of a scholar who rejects Burckhardt and Kelly. Burckhardt and Kelly. Okay, so in the first paragraph, we're told about Burckhardt and Kelly, we're told that some people reject them, and the second paragraph, we get more details about here's a specific scholar who actually did reject it. Okay, now what does the author think about all these points of view? I'm always curious if the author ever weighs in, or is the author just presenting stuff? Well, let's take a look at some of the info we get about Tina Krantieris. Well, in addition to being an example of someone who rejects Burckhardt and Kelly, the author also tells us a little bit more. According to the author, Krantieris conflates women and women writers, assuming that women's gender, irrespective of other social differences, including literacy, allows us to view women as a homogeneous social group. Okay, so that's a whole lot of detail there. But what I'm taking from that is, well, the author thinks that Tina Krantieris conflates women and women writers, so is kind of mixing up women and women writers. So it sounds like a criticism there. On the other hand, keep reading down a little farther, nonetheless, okay, so a contrast, Krantieris makes a significant contribution to the field. Okay, so I'm always interested when the author actually weighs in, tells us what they think. So I'm just going to make a little note of that here. The author is presenting this scholar who rejects Burckhardt and Kelly. That's, again, Tina Krantieris. And the author has some feelings about Krantieris. On the one hand, she conflates women and women writers, but on the other hand, she makes a significant contribution. Okay, so it's always interesting when the author weighs in. The author's presenting the scholar, but then also weighing in a little bit, telling us, well, there's good things and there's bad things about Krantieris. Okay, so now that we've kept all those different points of view straight, and also we have an idea of why did the author present these points of view, what's the overall purpose, let's take a look at the questions. So let's start. Okay, question 1. The author of the passage discusses Krantieris primarily to provide an example of an author who. Okay, so notice this is very typical. The questions always want to know, not simply what's being discussed, but why is the author bringing up different people, different scholars, right? So this just shows if we're keeping track of points of view, focused on purpose, we're kind of set up really nicely for these questions. Okay, so the author of the passage discusses Krantieris primarily to provide an example of an author who, A, is highly critical of the writings of certain Renaissance women. Okay, is that why Krantieris was mentioned? Well, Krantieris in his example of one of the scholars who reject Burckhardt and Kelly, Burckhardt and Kelly had positive and negative views of Renaissance women's status. Now, were any of these people critical of Renaissance women's writings? That just sounds out of scope, right? That's not what the passage is concerned with. Okay, B. So is Krantieris being mentioned as an example of a writer who, B, supports Kelly's view of women's status during the Renaissance? Well, again, just with our purpose statement, we know Crontiers is an example of someone who rejects Burckhardt and Kelly, but for sure doesn't support Kelly. Okay, C, has misinterpreted the works of certain Renaissance women. Well, okay, I remember this thing about Kelly, Crontiers was conflated women and women writers, so was confusing them in her analysis. But does that mean that she was misinterpreting their works? Well, that's a big stretch. But on top of that, I don't think that's primarily why Crontiers was mentioned. I mean, sure, the author has some feelings about Crontiers, but primarily the author is mentioning Crontiers as an example, right? Crontiers, for example. Okay, so it couldn't be C. That's not the primary reason Crontiers is mentioned. I'm not even sure it's true. D, has rejected the views of both Burckhardt and Kelly. Okay, well, that's true. On top of that, yeah, that's why the author is bringing up this person at all, right? We're continuing the discussion from the first paragraph, giving a specific example of someone who rejects Burckhardt and Kelly. D feels pretty good. Okay, how about E? Has studied Renaissance women in a wide variety of social and religious contexts. Okay, well, is that true about Crontiers? Well, Crontiers confuses women and women writers. Let's go back to that part of the passage. Okay, so Crontiers, in her fascinating study of 6 Renaissance women writers, does tend at times to conflate women and women writers. So it sounds like she's studying women writers. Crontiers is studying women writers. So is it true that she studied Renaissance women in a wide variety of social and religious contexts? That doesn't even seem to be true. Let alone that's not the purpose. That's not primarily why Crontiers is being mentioned. So E is wrong. It's just not a true statement. It's also not why. So it couldn't be why the author is mentioning Crontiers. Okay, so we're happy with D. All right, let's take a look at the next question. Okay, question 2. According to the passage, Crontiers' work differs from that of the scholars mentioned in the highlight text in which of the following ways? Okay, let's take a look at this highlighted text. Okay, and now we're asked, Crontiers' work differs from that of these scholars in which of the following ways? Okay, so looking at my purpose statements, nothing jumps out to me here because if I remember correctly, Crontiers is mentioned as an example of one of these feminist scholars, right? These feminist scholars reject Burckhardt and Kelly. Crontiers does the same. But now we're asked how they differ. Okay, so I'm going to look a little bit more about these feminist scholars in Crontiers. So if I start with the first paragraph, these feminist scholars, what are we told about them? These scholars stress the ways in which differences among Renaissance women, especially in terms of social status and religion, work to complicate the kinds of generalizations both Burckhardt and Kelly made on the basis of their observations about upper-class Italian women. Okay, so that's something new. These scholars stress the way that there's these differences amongst Renaissance women. And why is it important to note those differences? Well, they complicate the generalizations that Burckhardt and Kelly made. Okay, what generalizations did they make? Well, they just observed upper-class Italian women. They made generalizations. But these feminist scholars say, well, if you look at the differences amongst Renaissance women, that'll complicate the generalizations that Burckhardt and Kelly were making on the basis of just of upper-class Italian women. Okay, so that's one thing could be useful to know about these feminist scholars. What if we then go on to the next paragraph, we'll learn more about Crontiers and the group of scholars that she was representative of. Okay, so the trend is also evident, however. Okay, so this trend of rejecting Burckhardt and Kelly, also evident in works focusing on those middle and upper class European women whose ability to write gives them disproportionate representation in the historical record. Such women were, simply by virtue of their literacy, members of a tiny minority of the population. Okay, and then if we read further, we see Crontiers is given as an example of one of these folks. Crontiers conflates women and women writers. Okay, so I'm starting to see a contrast because the feminist scholars mentioned in the previous paragraph, they thought that, well, you can't make generalizations. They wanted to complicate the generalizations by looking at differences amongst Renaissance women. On the other hand, Crontiers is focusing just really specifically on women writers, and that's just a tiny minority, according to this paragraph. Okay, so I'm sensing there's some friction there. They both reject Burckhardt and Kelly, but in a nutshell, the feminist scholars want to focus on the differences, not just look at upper class women, whereas Crontiers is focusing on this tiny minority of women writers. Okay, let's see if that helps with the answer choices. According to the passage, Crontiers' work differs from that of the scholars mentioned in the highlighted text in which of the following ways. A. Crontiers' work stresses the achievements of Renaissance women rather than the obstacles to their success. Okay, well, is that true that she stresses their achievements rather than their obstacles? Well, remember, she's mentioned as someone who is both cautiously optimistic but recognizes the obstacles. Does she stress achievements over obstacles? That just doesn't sound right. Okay, I don't think that's even true about Crontiers, so let's get rid of that. Okay, B. Crontiers' work is based on a reinterpretation of the work of earlier scholars. Okay, is that true about Crontiers? She was rejecting Burckhardt and Kelly, but is she reinterpreting them? That doesn't sound like what she's doing at all, right? She's rejecting them, has her own point of view. To call that a reinterpretation is a stretch. Okay, C. Crontiers' views are at odds with those of both Burckhardt and Kelly. Okay, this is interesting. That's a true statement. And if I was just going to go around picking true statements, I might get tempted to pick C. But notice we're asked, Crontiers' work differs from that of the scholars mentioned in the highlighted text. In fact, they agreed on this. They both rejected Burckhardt and Kelly. Okay, so if I'm really specific about what the question is asking, C is out. D. Crontiers' work focuses on the place of women in Renaissance society. Okay, is that true? I mean, she studies Renaissance women writers. Is she focusing specifically on their place, and is that somehow a contrast to the earlier scholars? That doesn't sound like the basis of their disagreement, so I'm not crazy about D. Okay, E. Crontiers' views are based exclusively on the study of a privileged group of women. Okay, well, her study is based on a group of 6 Renaissance women writers. That's a tiny minority because they were literate. And the previous scholars, the ones in the highlighted text, they're really concerned about generalizing based on upper class women. They want to focus on the differences. Okay, so that seems like a point of difference there. Crontiers' views are based on the study of a privileged group of women, but these feminist scholars, they want to look at the differences. They don't just want to focus on upper class women. So E is correct. Okay, great. Let's take a look at question number 3. Okay, question number 3. According to the passage, feminist scholars cite Burckhardt's view of Renaissance women primarily for which of the following reasons? Okay, so why are these scholars mentioning Burckhardt? And which feminist scholars are we talking about? Because I remember we have the feminist scholars like Kelly who reject Burckhardt because they thought, well, actually, Renaissance women had a terrible time. Burckhardt thought they had a great time. Or we could be talking about the later feminist scholars who reject Burckhardt and Kelly. Okay, but if I think about it, well, both of them really, no matter which one I pick, is rejecting Burckhardt. And that's kind of why they're presenting him, not to agree with him, but to present this is an idea that I disagree with. Okay, so just by kind of thinking big picture, keeping our eye on the author's purpose, how do these different points of view interrelate? I've got a pretty good idea about what 3 is talking about. Okay, so let's try out the answers. According to the passage, feminist scholars cite Burckhardt's view of Renaissance women primarily for which of the following reasons? A, Burckhardt's view forms the basis for most arguments refuting Kelly's point of view. Okay, do these feminist scholars want to refute Kelly? Well, yes, but not by using Burckhardt's views. They want to refute Kelly and Burckhardt. It's not as though Burckhardt is the reason for refuting Kelly. They're rejecting them both for different reasons. Okay, so A doesn't do the trick. How about B? Burckhardt's view has been discredited by Kelly. Okay, well, Kelly does disagree with Burckhardt. But is that the precise reason why they're mentioning it? Again, B is like temptingly a true statement, but is that primarily why feminist scholars are citing Burckhardt? Because he rejected Kelly? No, that doesn't make sense. Burckhardt's view is one that many feminist scholars wish to refute. Okay, yes, Burckhardt's mentioned in order to be refuted. That's what the scholars who mentioned him, that's why he's mentioned, in order to refute him, in order to reject his ideas. So C seems pretty good. D, Burckhardt's work provides rich historical evidence of inequality between Renaissance women and men. Well, actually, it's the exact opposite, right? Burckhardt is all about how there's equality between Renaissance men and women. So D just gets the detail wrong. Okay, how about E? Burckhardt's work includes historical research supporting the arguments of the feminist scholars. Well, the feminist scholars are for sure rejecting Burckhardt. They're not citing him for support. So it couldn't be E. Okay, so we're left with C. All right, let's take a look at the next question. Okay, question 4. It can be inferred that both Burckhardt and Kelly have been criticized by the scholars mentioned in the highlighted text for which of the following? Okay, so remembering the author's purpose in the first paragraph, I know those scholars are mentioned because they reject Burckhardt's rosy view and Kelly's dark view. Okay, so I know that they reject Burckhardt and Kelly, these scholars, but why are they rejecting them? I don't think my purpose statement captured the fine grain of why they were being rejected. So this is a question where, okay, I know where to look in the passage, so let's see what we can pick up. Okay, so I'm going to the highlighted scholars. What does it tell me? That they rejected Kelly and Burckhardt? I already knew that. I read the next sentence. Many recent works by these scholars stress the ways in which differences among Renaissance women, especially in terms of social status and religion, work to complicate the kinds of generalizations both Burckhardt and Kelly made on the basis of their observations about upper-class Italian women. Okay, so let's just go through this and unpack it. I think it was relevant to one of the previous questions, but let's just make sure that we're solid on what this is telling us about the feminist scholars and their points of view on Burckhardt and Kelly. Okay, so they're stressing differences amongst Renaissance women, especially in terms of social status and religion. Okay, so there's differences of status, differences of religion. They want to stress those. Why? Well, they complicate the generalizations that Burckhardt and Kelly made. Okay, so they want to complicate these generalizations. What are these generalizations that Burckhardt and Kelly made? Well, they were observing upper-class Italian women and then making generalizations just based on that small group. But the feminist scholars, the highlighted scholars, they want to stress differences amongst women and say that those are important. Those complicate your generalizations based on just upper-class women. Okay, so I already had a sense that these highlighted scholars are rejecting Burckhardt and Kelly, but now I know specifically why. Because Burckhardt and Kelly made generalizations based on upper-class Italian women, but the scholars, they want to complicate those. They want to look at differences in social status and religion. Okay, so let's see which of these answer choices do we like, which ones can we get rid of? It can be inferred that both Burckhardt and Kelly have been criticized by the scholars mentioned in the highlighted text for which of the following? A, assuming that women writers of the Renaissance are representative of women in general. Okay, so some things here actually kind of catch my ear. They're making an assumption and it's about Renaissance women, and that a certain group is representative of women in general. Okay, so if I was just kind of focusing on that part, I'm kind of tempted by A, because Burckhardt and Kelly were assuming that upper-class Italian women were in fact representative, and so you could make a generalization about them. But the scholars are saying, no, we want to complicate those generalizations. Okay, but then something isn't sitting right with me, assuming that women writers of the Renaissance. Okay, if I'm really specific in my reading, I see, no, Burckhardt and Kelly were focusing on upper-class Italian women. Is that the same as women writers? No, that's a problem. Okay, now another point. If I start allowing my points of view to bleed together, I might start thinking about Crontiers. And Crontiers, in fact, yes, as we know based on our previous readings, Crontiers made generalizations based on a group of 6 women writers and thought that they were representative. Okay, but the scholars are not criticizing Crontiers, right? They're specifically criticizing Burckhardt and Kelly. That's what the question is asking about. Burckhardt and Kelly did not focus on women writers, so that's the wrong detail there. A is definitely out. Okay, B, drawing conclusions that are based on the study of an atypical group of women. Okay, well, I'm not seeing some of the specific language in the passage, such as, upper-class Italian women or generalizations. But on the other hand, let's really think about the meaning of B. Did Burckhardt and Kelly draw conclusions based on the study of an atypical group of women? Okay, well, they drew conclusions based on upper-class Italian women, and the scholars think, well, they're atypical. They're not representative, right? You can't generalize based on upper-class women. You need to look at differences in social status. Okay, so if I think about the meaning of what B is saying, right? I'm not trying to match up words with the passage, but I'm saying, does B capture the meaning of what I want? It looks pretty good, right? Those Burckhardt and Kelly were drawing conclusions based on this atypical group. The scholars had a problem with that. Okay, again, doesn't specifically mention upper-class women, but the thing about upper-class women, according to these scholars, is that they were atypical, and that's the problem. Okay, so B isn't bad. How about C? Failing to describe clearly the relationship between social status and literacy among Renaissance women. The relationship between social status and literacy. Okay, I think I remember that being discussed at some point. Women writers are literate, and therefore they're a very small minority. But that was in the past part about Crontiers. I don't think that's something that Burckhardt and Kelly are faulted for at any point. Okay, so C, not even close. How about D? Failing to acknowledge the role played by Renaissance women in opposing cultural stereotypes. Okay, I'm not even sure where to start with this one. That doesn't, Burckhardt, did I miss something is almost my first thought, but no, I remember I read the relevant sentence. Burckhardt and Kelly made generalizations based on upper-class Italian women. I think later on we learn when Crontiers' research is mentioned, the idea of women opposing cultural stereotypes, but struggling to do that because of obstacles. But again, not related to Burckhardt and Kelly, not related to the scholars' rejection of them. Okay, so I'm not tempted by D. E, failing to acknowledge the ways in which social status affected. Okay, now I'm just going to pause there. If I was reading really fast and I skipped over the rest of the sentence and I just read that part, failing to acknowledge the ways in which social status affected, all of a sudden I'm pretty tempted by E, right? Yeah, they did fail to acknowledge the ways in which being an upper class woman is not something that you can generalize about. Okay, so all of a sudden I'm interested in E, but I'm going to keep up my close, precise reading all the way to the end. Failing to acknowledge the ways in which social status affected the creative activities of Renaissance women. Wait, affected their creative activities? Okay, that's a really specific criticism. They said that you can't generalize based on upper class Italian women and make generalizations about whether they were in a position of equality or inequality, but they're not specifically concerned about the creative activities of Renaissance women. That's just veering way off into left field. I don't like E. Okay, well, let's go back to B, make sure we like it. Did these scholars say Burckhardt and Kelly can be criticized because of their drawing conclusions that are based on the study of an atypical group of women? Okay, yep, I can see how that works, right? It doesn't actually mention upper class women, but it says, but they felt that upper class women were atypical, right? That's the feminist scholars' criticism. You can't make a conclusion based on just upper class women. So they're going to fault Burckhardt and Kelly for drawing conclusions based on an atypical group of women. So B is correct. Okay, I hope you found those passages somewhat challenging, and I hope you found the idea of keeping track of point of view helpful when it came to answering the questions. If I'm going to leave you with one thought, it would be, please don't just focus on what it is that you're reading. You always want to be asking yourself, specifically, whose point of view am I getting? Is the author talking to me directly? Am I getting someone else being presented by the author? How does the author feel about all that? Whatever it is, you always want to know who exactly is speaking. And once you're clear on that, you want to ask yourself, why is that point of view being presented? How does it relate to the author's overall purpose? So I think, as you saw going through those questions, if you allow those different points of view to bleed together, the questions get a lot more confusing. On the other hand, if you can keep the different points of view separate and clean and distinct, and you know exactly how are they relating to the author's purpose, then you're going to be in much better shape. All right, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.